Hey, how's it going? Let's take a wee look at Brothers Karamazov. I'm going to do a long-term serialized vlog-style playlist on the channel, going through Brothers Karamazov, because it helps me to consolidate what I've read, and it's something that I appreciate myself in as much as I'm doing right now with Bleak House. So at the moment I'm 200 pages from the end of that brilliant novel, and I'm getting a lot out of Katie Lumsden's videos where she goes through chapter by chapter. So yeah, that's what I'm going to do with Brothers Karamazov, and also with Anna Karenina. You might have already seen on my channel, the first one of them has gone out, so if you're reading either of those two books, yeah, subscribe and follow, that'd be great. Now, for Brothers Karamazov, I'm reading it with Dana, who's a Substack writer, a Dostoevsky scholar, and she's running this group read of Brothers Karamazov, which started in January, so we're already a month in, but we're going slow, nice and slow. So if you want to join in, go and check her out, because I'm going to be talking a lot about what I've learned from her excellent posts. So she goes into a lot of detail, for example, on the names of the characters and what the Russian is derived from, possibly. So she goes deep, and it's really an interesting Substack that she has, which is following on from her Crime and Punishment Substack last year. So Brothers Karamazov, I have some history with it. I read it when I was a student back at St Andrews. Would have been in the back half of the 90s when I was in my honours years, junior honours or senior honours, I can't remember which one it was. And I didn't like it, struggled with it, didn't enjoy it, had to read it to get my module and my marks to get my degree, and I had to do a presentation on it, which, yeah, the less said about the better. But I do remember it had something to do with Elder Zosima, one of the characters that we'll get to. So I read Crime and Punishment last year. I'm still quite not finished it yet, so if you're following along with that, we'll get there. I'm in part 6 of that, so nearly done. But since Dana started with Brothers Karamazov in January, I've jumped into that. And I'm reading this translation here, which is the Avsi translation. I'm finding it to be the smoothest, the easiest to read. So if I read out quotations, that's the translation it will be from. If you're following along, yours might be a wee bit different. This one I showed you a minute ago is the Pavir and Volokonsky translation. And I also have this Clothbound Classic, which I really like. This is the David McDuff translation. So I like to compare as I go, because I know Russian and I was a translator for many years, so that interests me. So look out for some translation comparisons as we go. So that's the preamble. I read part 1 of book 1, or chapter. No, book 1 is broken down into multiple books. So I read book 1 with Dana in January, and I just reread it because it hadn't really gone in, and it's a vital part of the book because it introduces the brothers Karamazov, which, by the way, on a translation point, you might see this one here is called the Karamazov Brothers. An interesting point in translation. In English, of course, that's what we would say, but in Russian the title is Bratya Karamazova. So, was it Bratya Karamazovy? It would be the other way around in Russian, so generally speaking in English we call it the Brothers Karamazov, and that's probably what I'll call it as I go through these videos, because that's what I'm most used to calling it. So let me just start by thanking Dana for the work that she's doing out there for students of Dostoevsky. It's such valuable work, and it's so helpful. You know, I mentioned Katie with Bleak House doing videos. Dana's doing something similar with written content, and it's so valuable. So thank you, Dana, for all that you do and for making the reading of this novel so much richer. So I hope to bring some of that to my channel here for those that are following along. Right, so I've taken copious notes. I don't know how long this will take. I'm surrounded by notes and books. Hopefully it's not going to be super long, but it'll take as long as it takes. So we'll start with the narrator. So the beginning of the book has a section called From the Author, and it's really the narrator talking about, there's only one page, talking about what the novel's about and introducing the characters and stuff. And he says here that the novel takes place as long as 13 years ago and is not so much a novel as a single episode in my hero's early youth. So, who is the narrator? We don't know. This novel was Dostoevsky's last, and he died just after publication. He intended it to be, as we learn in this introduction here, one of two. So he was going to continue the story, and we can either be grateful that we got the first one and he finished it before he died, or we can be annoyed that we didn't get the second one. I'm going to go with the first. Very grateful that we have this novel. And of course now Dostoevsky scholars can talk endlessly about what the second novel would have been about, you know, and who the narrator is, because we don't really learn that. We might have learned it in the second one, who knows. We know that he's male because of the way that the verbs are structured in Russian. Russian is a gendered language, so a masculine or a feminine verb you'd be able to tell, and the verbs are all masculine for the narrator. We know that he was involved with the monastery somehow, so we'll talk about that later as we go on. What else do we know? Not a great deal, actually. We know that he's talking about events that occurred 13 years ago, so that's in the introduction, and then in the very first part of the first chapter, where we're introduced to Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, who's the father of the three brothers. It says that Alexei Fyodorovich Karamazov was the third son of Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, a landowner of our district, extremely well known in his time, on account of his violent and mysterious death exactly 13 years ago, the circumstances of which I shall relate in due course. So, spoilers, you know, we know that the father's going to be killed mysteriously 13 years ago. So, yeah, we straight away we've got an interesting novel ahead of us, we know that. And that's what we learn in the first paragraph. So that's the narrator. We've got Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov mentioned. We've got the third son, Alexei, who's also known as Alyosha. And if you want to learn more about the naming conventions in Russian, go check out Dana's excellent post about that. Superb. So the brothers Karamazov, the Karamazov brothers. There are three. We've already mentioned the youngest, Alexei / Alyosha. The eldest is Dmitry, or Mitya, or Mityenka. He is 27. We've got Ivan, who is 23, and we've got Alexei, who's 20. And we've got the age of the father, Fyodor Pavlovich, approximately 55. Dmitry's mother is Adelaida Ivanovna Musova. The other brother's mother is Sofia Ivanovna. So the brothers have two different mothers, which means that Fyodor Pavlovich had two different wives. Dmitri's mother, Adelaida, is of noble birth. She's well-to-do. And I think he just marries her for her money. That's kind of the impression we get. There wasn't much love between the two of them. He marries her, he takes the dowry of 25,000 rubles, pockets it, tries to take her estate off her, and she doesn't take any of his snash. She basically beats him and gives him a hard time. So, yeah, it's a loveless marriage, and there's a scene in that which would make a nice little translation comparison for you. So, here we've got in the Avsi translation, his wife, however, happened to be the only woman in his life who failed totally to arouse any passion in him whatsoever. Right, let's read the same section from Pavir and Volokonsky. This one woman alone, sensually speaking, made no particular impression on him. Not bad. Let's have a look at Macduff. Yet it appears that this woman alone failed to make any particular impression on him from the voluptuary point of view. Yeah, it's a little awkward, isn't it? Have you ever used the word voluptuary? I haven't. So that gives you an idea of just how different the translations can be. I don't have the Russian actually, which is interesting, because I like to have the Russian when I'm doing this kind of project. I'll need to get my hands on a copy. So, yeah, loveless marriage with Adelaida. We've got the birth of Dmitri, their son. Adelaida dies when Dmitri is 4, I think. I should have that written down somewhere. Right, so Dmitri is raised by Grigory, the house servant. Then Adelaida's cousin looks after him for a bit, Pyotr Alexandrovich Musov, and then he buggers off back to France. He's a cosmopolitan, educated and wealthy liberal type who's involved with the French Revolution, and he also gets himself involved in a dispute with the monastery over fishing or timber felling rights. His property borders the monastery that we learn more about later on. And then he goes back to Paris. Mitya gets palmed off onto a distant aunt in Moscow. She dies. And then he's taken in by one of her daughters. And that's all we get. More to come, it would seem. He doesn't finish his studies. He goes to military college. He fights in the Caucasus. He enjoys wine, women and song. He gets himself into debt. And his father gives him money in drips and drabs until he's basically spent his inheritance, but he doesn't know that. And at the beginning of the story, he goes back to his father's town, or his own hometown, and they fall out. There's a dispute about the inheritance because he discovers that he's exhausted all he's likely to get from his father, which is a bit of a problem. So that's Dmitri. Third chapter of book 1, we've got the second marriage. So this is to Sofia Ivanovna, whose surname we don't learn. She's an orphan. She's raised by a cruel and aristocratic widow. She's had a failed suicide attempt as a young woman. And she marries Fyodor Pavlovich at the age of 16 to escape her benefactress, the cruel aristocratic widow. She's not treated well by her husband, and she has a kind of breakdown that leads to her becoming a klikusha. So in the footnotes in the Avsi translation, we learn simply that klikusha comes from the verb klikać, which is to shriek or to yell, and little else. So I'm going to refer you to what Dana has written about that because it's much more comprehensive. So we've got many translations have replaced the Russian term klikusha with simpler descriptions such as mad women or shrieking women. However, this word carries a specific cultural and historical meaning. Ivan and Alexei's mother was a klikusha, and we will encounter more stories about these afflicted women. The klikushi were believed to be possessed by dark forces. So, thank you, Dana. Sofia Ivanovna was a klikusha. So she dies. Yeah, again, another mother dying when Alyosha is 4, and he remembers her as if in a dream. And the two brothers, Ivan and Alyosha, they're both born to Sofia Ivanovna. They're raised again by Grigory, the manservant. The cruel widow then takes the brothers. So when Sofia Ivanovna dies, her mother comes to take the boys away, and she gives Fyodor Pavlovich a few slaps for being a bad father. She gives Grigory a few slaps for being a bad guardian and takes the boys off to bring them up. And then guess what? Yeah, she dies. So then the kids are brought up by Yefim Petrovich Palyonov, who we are told simply is a principal beneficiary. We get some descriptions of Ivan, so the middle boy. He's morose and introverted. He enters boarding school in Moscow at 13. His benefactor dies, and he has a hard time during his first 2 years at university. He asks nothing of his father and finds work to get him through his studies. So he's a self-made man. He gets himself through his studies by becoming a writer. He becomes a good writer, actually. So he's an academic, and he's a hard worker. He doesn't shirk. And then he turns up at his father's, we know not why, but we learn that he's been corresponding with his brother Dmitri. Okay, so that takes us on to the third brother, Alexei, Alyosha, who is 20 years old. We're told that he's no fanatic or mystic, he's simply a youthful philanthropist. And he's into the monastic way of life. He offered his parched soul the true path from the darkness of worldly evil to the radiance of love. So, yeah, he's made out to be a very spiritual man. He's not egotistical at all. There's a lot of description here about the kind of man he is. For example, the gift of engendering love was innate, therefore stemming from his very nature, as it were, without artifice or stratagem. Everybody loved this young man wherever he went from his earliest childhood. He was seldom boisterous and seldom even happy, but just one look at him was enough to see that this was not on account of any sullen streak in his nature, and that, on the contrary, he was even-tempered and serene. He never sought to assert himself amongst his peers. Perhaps this was why he was never afraid of anyone, and yet the other boys understood immediately that he took no pride in his courage, but seemed completely unaware of his own bravery and fearlessness. He never bore a grudge. Yet he loved people. It seems that he lived his whole life with an absolute faith in people, though no one ever thought of him as simple or naive. So yeah, we get more description of him, I think, than we do of the other brothers, at least in terms of his temperament and character. So he ends up coming back to the family house. He leaves his studies before he's finished. Let's go back a bit. Who's YPP? Yefim Petrovich Palyonov. He dies and his widow heads off to Italy, and Alyosha is palmed off onto distant relatives of Yefim Petrovich's. Unlike Ivan, Alyosha's not bothered about money. He has the aura of a holy fool about him. Pyotr Alexandrovich Musov describes Alyosha in a single paragraph. Here we have perhaps the only person in the world who, if he were to be suddenly abandoned without a kopeck in the central square of a strange city of 1 million people, would never come to grief, never die of hunger or cold, because somebody would immediately feed him, immediately take him under their wing, or, failing that, he would survive by his own wits, which would be no hardship or humiliation for him, while anyone who helped him would not find it a chore at all, but perhaps, on the contrary, would even look upon it as a pleasure. So that's the kind of guy he is. Then we get from the narrator, there was another reason that Alyosha came home. So when he comes home, he tells his father that he wants to visit the grave of his mother. That's the reason that he gives for coming back. Now, his father doesn't know where the grave is. He buggered off, and when the mother died, he went off to Odessa and got involved with some business with the Jews, and didn't even pay for the headstone or anything. So it was the manservant Grigori that saw to all of that. So when Alyosha turns up, it's Grigori that takes Alyosha to the grave. But the narrator tells us that that's not the only reason. He tells us that he's being drawn relentlessly along a new, unexplored path. So I suppose that's an indication of his spiritual path, which we learn at the end of this bit means he wants to enter the monastery. Yeah, so he seeks his father's blessing to enter the monastery, and his father gives him his blessing, and then starts going on about hell, whether it has a roof, and about whether the devil has got his hooks into him. Where are the hooks manufactured in hell? How would hooks work even if there was a roof? So there's a lot of stuff about that, which was mildly humorous actually. And then he began to snivel. He says, "I feel you're the only person on earth who hasn't condemned me, my dear boy. I really feel this. How can I fail to feel it?" So that's Fyodor Pavlovich to his son, Alyosha. And that's where we finish part 1. So I'm going to leave this video there. Part 2 is set in the monastery. So we'll get to meet the elder Zosima and learn about what's going on. Why have all the brothers come back to visit Fyodor Pavlovich? What's going on? So yeah, I'm enjoying it. I think this process is going to work for me. This note-taking with my fountain pen and my Leuchtturm notebook is going to work for me. So as I said at the beginning, if you want to read along, then go and check out Dana's Substack. Of course, I will put a link down below to that, so you can come and find that and join in, read her excellent posts. And yeah, that's me. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye for now.